My name is Celeste Thompson. I'm 63 years old, and tonight I stand before you not as a victim, not as a bitter woman, but as a mother who refused to be erased. I want you to remember this story because no one expects to find their child abandoned outside on a night meant for celebration. But that is exactly how my war began, with snow biting through my coat and my daughter shaking in my arms while the people who claimed to love her laughed by the fire inside. It was New Year's Eve in Aspen, Colorado. I had driven up Red Mountain Drive, the road slick with ice, my old Subaru growling in protest the entire climb. Fireworks echoed over the town below, ribbons of light decorating the dark sky, but I felt no joy. For 3 years, something inside me had been unsettled, an instinct the kind only a mother carries gnawing at my gut. I hadn't heard my daughter Amara's voice in all that time, not truly. Blocked numbers, returned letters, doors closed quietly but firmly. Still, the pull of her never left me. That night I could no longer ignore it. When I reached the Whitmore estate, it glowed against the snow like a monument. Stone walls, glass windows, warm golden light spilling into the night. Music thundered, champagne glasses clinked, and laughter poured out as if the family had never known sorrow. And then, through the flurry of falling snow, I saw her. Amara, my only child. She was outside in the cold, standing barefoot in the snow in nothing but thin pajamas. Her lips trembled blue, her arms crossed tight across her chest. She was 25 years old, but in that moment she looked as small and fragile as she had the day she took her first steps in our tiny Denver apartment. My heart fractured. My breath caught. Rage and grief collided inside me. I slammed the car door and stumbled through the drifts toward her. "Amara!" shouted. Her glassy eyes lifted, and with a voice weak from trembling, she whispered one word. "Mama!" I tore my coat from my shoulders, wrapping it around her body, pulling her into me. Her skin was ice, her body shaking so violently it rattled through my bones. "You're safe now," I whispered. "I've got you." I pressed her head against my chest, trying to warm her with nothing but the heat of my heart. But then, through the grand windows of that fortress, I saw them. Nathan, her husband. Elaine and Richard, his proud parents. His sisters in their designer gowns. All of them bathed in warmth and firelight, glasses raised in toast. They celebrated while my child froze alone on the steps. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I stormed to the front door with Amara clutched tight against me. There was no knocking, no asking permission. I threw the door open so hard the hinges groaned. The room fell silent. Music stuttered. Faces turned pale as champagne glasses froze midair. Elaine gasped, her diamonds catching the light. Richard's jaw tightened. And Nathan, polished, arrogant Nathan, stepped forward with anger etched across his face. "What are you doing here?" he spat. I ignored him. I stood there, holding my trembling daughter, and I delivered 7 words that sliced through the air sharper than any blade. "Security cameras saw you. Police are outside." Their faces drained of color, like the blood itself had abandoned them. Elaine's hand trembled against her pearls. Richard looked down at his scotch as though it might provide a defense. And Nathan, for the first time since I had met him, looked afraid. I turned without another word, slamming the door behind me, sealing them in with their lies and cruelty. I carried my daughter back into the storm, where the night felt cleaner than the poisoned air inside. As fireworks lit the sky at midnight, I whispered a vow into her ear. "They took 3 years from us, baby. But I swear on my soul, we will take everything from them." And before I take you deeper into what came after that night, let me ask you something from one human being to another. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments, Because stories like mine, they don't belong to one place. They can happen anywhere. That was how my fight began. When I think back to when it all started, I see Amara at 22, standing in the doorway of our little apartment off Federal Boulevard in Denver. Her eyes glowing in a way I hadn't seen before. She had just finished her undergrad at the University of Colorado, juggling classes and 2 part-time jobs, and she told me she had someone special to introduce. I still remember the way she smoothed her dress nervously, the way her voice lifted when she said, "Mama, this is Nathan." He walked in behind her like he already owned the room. Polished suit, slick hair, a smile practiced in mirrors, and a bottle of wine whose label I couldn't pronounce. My living room was small, chipped coffee table, sagging couch cushions, but it was ours. I had worked double shifts for years to keep that roof over us, and I watched his eyes sweep across it, not with curiosity, but with judgment. He didn't need to say a word. Felt it. Dinner that night should have been warm. I made my best pot roast, seasoned just the way Amara loved since childhood, with cornbread and sweet tea on the side. But Nathan barely touched his plate, pushing the food around like it offended him. He laughed at my stories late, forced, as though humoring me. Every time Amara spoke, he'd correct a detail or redirect the conversation back to himself. And when he stepped out to take a call halfway through the meal, my daughter's smile slipped. Just for a moment. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her jaw tightened. It was the first time I saw her bending, folding herself smaller to fit into someone else's world. The Whitmores invited me to dinner once after that. Just once. Their estate in Aspen was more museum than home. Cold marble floors, chandeliers that looked like icicles, walls covered in art I wasn't supposed to recognize. Elaine greeted me with a smile so thin it might have cracked if she held it longer. She complimented my braids like they were some exotic oddity, then asked if I'd ever considered a more polished look. Richard barely looked at me while talking about investments and politics, dismissing me mid-sentence like I was background noise. I waited for Nathan to defend me, or for Amara to hold my hand under the table, but neither did. He sat straighter than ever, soaking in his parents' approval. She laughed on cue, lowered her voice, and played along. The girl who once filled our apartment with music and laughter had dimmed her light to fit into their glass fortress. Silence can wound deeper than words ever could. I learned that in the years after Amara's wedding, when the Whitmores perfected their cruelty not with shouting, not with violence, but with exclusion. They didn't slam doors in my face. They closed them quietly and made sure the locks clicked so softly I almost doubted if I'd ever had a key in the first place. Began with the phone calls. At first she would answer quickly, her voice rushed but sweet. "Mama, I'm fine. Just busy." Then came the delays, hours, then days before she returned a call. And then one afternoon I dialed and got that sharp, cold message. "This number has been blocked." My hands trembled as if the phone itself had betrayed me. I tried again and again, but it was the same every time. My daughter, the one I had raised on lullabies and late-night ramen noodles, had vanished behind a digital wall. I turned to letters. Handwritten, the way I always used to write her notes on birthdays or slip reminders into her school lunches. I poured my heart into every envelope. Memories, prayers, small updates about home. Weeks later, they all returned in a neat stack, unopened, the corners unbent, the handwriting still my own. On the top of one envelope, a clerk had scrawled, "Moved, no forwarding." Move. As if my daughter had packed up her life and erased me from the address book in one stroke. Holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving, when I cooked a whole spread. Sweet potato pie, collard greens, roast turkey, just in case she showed up. I set her place at the table, the plate and glass waiting. my eyes drifting to the door every time the wind rattled the screen. But the chair stayed empty. Christmas came and went without her laughter filling the living room. On her birthdays, I lit candles alone, whispered her name into the dark, and prayed she could feel me somewhere beneath all the marble and chandeliers. Every holiday card I mailed to Aspen came back unopened. Every gift I tried to deliver was turned away by staff at the gate. Once, I drove all the way up to the estate on Red Mountain with a basket of Amara's favorite things. Her childhood quilt, a stack of old photo albums, and a pie still warm from the oven. A uniformed guard met me at the entrance and told me politely, almost kindly, that visitors aren't permitted. I asked him to just hand the basket to my daughter. He shook his head. The look in his eyes told me even he knew it was cruel, but he did his job. I drove home in silence, the pie still in the back seat, the quilt folded tight against the cold. It wasn't just Nathan. It wasn't just his parents. It was all of them. They drew an invisible line, a wall of glass, and forced Amara to stand on their side of it. Slowly I watched her disappear. She stopped posting the small things she used to share online. Stopped sending texts with silly emojis late at night. Stopped reaching for me entirely. The Whitmores didn't take her by storm. They smothered her voice until silence was the only language she spoke. That silence broke me in ways I still struggle to describe. I would sit in the living room late at night, holding the phone in my hand, staring at her blocked number as if sheer willpower might push the call through. I began carrying her old childhood drawings in my bag, flipping them open when I needed proof that she was real, that I hadn't imagined the little girl who once told me she wanted to be a singer. But as the months stretched into years, something inside me hardened. I realized silence was their weapon, their fortress, their illusion of control. And if I was going to fight them, and I knew deep down that fight was inevitable, I couldn't do it by begging to be let back in. I had to find the crack in their wall of silence and split it wide open. 3 years passed like that. Birthdays whispered into empty rooms, holidays marked with unanswered prayers, letters piling up in a box of return-to-sender shame. And yet, even through all of it, I felt something no Whitmore could erase. A mother's instinct. That gnawing, restless voice that told me Amara wasn't thriving in that mansion. She was drowning. And on New Year's Eve, when I saw her standing barefoot in the snow outside their golden house, I knew my instinct had been right all along. They hadn't just taken my daughter's voice. They had stolen her safety. And for that they would pay. The Whitmore estate in Aspen was less a home and more a monument. I remember the first time I drove up that winding road, my hands tightening on the steering wheel as the house rose into view. It was the kind of place people put on magazine covers. Walls of glass, tall stone columns, manicured evergreens framing the driveway. From the outside, it looked unshakable, like wealth itself had been poured into its foundation. But I've been alive long enough to know looks can lie. A place that polished often hides a rot you can't smell until you're too close. They had invited me for dinner not long after Amara and Nathan's engagement. I thought it was a gesture of acceptance, a chance to meet on common ground. Instead, it felt like a test. I walked in with my head high, carrying a sweet potato pie still warm from the oven, the same one my own mother taught me to make. Brown sugar, nutmeg, a crust crimped by hand. That pie had followed us through years of holidays, birthdays, and Sunday dinners when times were lean. It was a piece of my family, of Amara's roots. The table was set like a stage. China gleaming, silver polished, chandeliers dripping light like icicles. Elaine floated across the room in pearls, her smile practiced and brittle. She took the pie from my hands and placed it at the far end of the table, as though it were a decoration rather than food. Richard poured himself a scotch before even greeting me. his eyes already scanning for the next person worth his time. We sat down, and I watched as dish after dish was unveiled by their staff. Delicate plates with sauces drizzled like paintings, the kind of food designed to impress, not to feed. My pie was finally passed around. Thin slices served without ceremony. Elaine took one polite bite, pressed her lips together, and set her fork down. "Interesting," she said softly. Richard smirked. "Picked it up at the store, did you?" The room chuckled, sharp and restrained, as if cruelty were part of the performance. I looked at Amara then, praying she would defend me, remind them that this was her childhood favorite, that her mother's hands had shaped it. Instead, I saw her eyes flick toward me, apologetic, before she forced a laugh to match theirs. That laugh cut deeper than Richard's smirk or Elaine's sugar-coated insult. Because in that moment, I realized she wasn't standing beside me anymore. She was standing with them. It was subtle, but it was clear. A line had been drawn that night. Every smile, every polite word, every dig disguised as refinement, it all built a wall meant to shut me out. They didn't have to forbid Amara from seeing me. They didn't have to raise their voices. They simply made sure she knew which side of the table was acceptable to sit on. I drove home that night with tears blurring the mountain road, my pie dish rattling empty in the back seat. I thought about all the years I had raised Amara alone, the birthdays scraped together with homemade cakes, the Christmas mornings where her joy made every sacrifice worth it. And now here she was, smoothing her dress, lowering her voice, folding herself into their glass fortress while I stood outside, watching. That Thanksgiving was the last real invitation I ever received. After that, doors began to close one by one. Amara's visits grew fewer, her calls shorter. The silence deepened. And I understood. They didn't just want her love. They wanted her allegiance. They wanted to erase me entirely, to make sure her roots never showed in their world of chandeliers and polished silver. But what the Whitmores never understood is that fortresses, no matter how tall or gleaming, are fragile when built on glass. They crack under pressure. They shatter when the wrong stone is thrown. And that night, as I drove down the mountain with my heart heavy and my hands shaking on the wheel, I made myself a promise. One day I would find their weak stone. And when I did, their fortress would come down around them. The drive down from Red Mountain felt longer than the climb up. My hazard lights blinked against the snow as I clutched the wheel with one hand and held Amara close with the other. She was trembling so hard it rattled through my bones. I kept telling her, "Stay with me, baby, stay with me," as if my voice alone could warm her. By the time we pulled into Aspen Valley Hospital, it was just minutes before midnight. The ER doors slid open, and nurses rushed forward, lifting Amara gently from my arms onto a stretcher. They wrapped her in warmed blankets, checked her vitals, and clipped monitors to her fingers. I hovered, still clutching her discarded pajamas in my hand like a relic. "Core temperature's low," one nurse murmured. "Early signs of frostnip on the toes." Another checked her oxygen, her pulse. Their voices were calm, but I caught the looks they exchanged. Looks that said, "What kind of family leaves a young woman outside like this?" I stood by the bed, my hands shaking, until a doctor approached me with a clipboard. "Are you her mother?" he asked. He nodded. My voice cracked when I answered, "Yes, I'm her mother." For the first time in years, I was allowed to claim her without correction, without judgment. No Whitmore in the room to cut me down. They let me sit at her bedside as the warm fluids dripped into her fore. I brushed the damp hair from her forehead, whispering the same lullabies I sang when she was a child with fevers in our small Denver apartment. Slowly, the shivering lessened. Her color returned, though faint. And when her eyes fluttered open, she looked at me like I was both familiar and foreign. "Mama," she whispered, her voice brittle. I didn't think you'd come. I'll always come, I told her. Always. She turned her face into my hand and wept, the sound muffled against my palm. When she finally drifted into a restless sleep, I stepped out to the waiting area and did what I should have done 3 years earlier. I drove straight to the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office and filed a domestic incident report. I told them exactly what I had seen. My daughter left outside, barefoot in the snow, while her husband's family celebrated indoors. The deputy on duty looked stunned, typing every word with careful precision. Do you want to press charges? He asked. My throat tightened. Not yet, I said. But I need it on record. I need someone besides me to know the truth. By the time I returned to the hospital, Amara was awake again. She wouldn't meet my eyes at first, her gaze fixed on the thin hospital blanket. Then, in fragments, she began to speak. Nathan doesn't like when I talk too much, she said, her fingers twisting the edge of the sheet. He says it embarrasses him. His mom says I dress wrong, that I make him look bad. His dad says I shouldn't argue. Her words stumbled out, fragile, but each one sliced me open. She looked up at me suddenly, panic in her eyes. They said you were dangerous. They said if I let you close, you'd ruin everything. Her lips trembled as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Mama, I was so scared. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would be easier. I sat beside her, holding her hand firm. They taught you silence because silence keeps them in control. But you don't have to be quiet anymore. You're with me now. She leaned into me, her sobs shaking her thin frame, and for the first time in years, I felt her collapse into my arms the way she used to when she was little. That night in Aspen Valley Hospital, I understood 2 things with absolute clarity. My daughter had been broken by the Whitmore's control, and I would never let them near her again. The Whitmores thought they could bury me in silence. They thought time and distance would finish the job. But as I held Amara in that hospital bed, I felt the silence crack. And when silence breaks, the sound can be louder than any scream. I thought the worst of it had already been revealed in that hospital room in Aspen, but I was wrong. Once the dam of silence cracked, more truth spilled out than I was prepared to hear. The next morning, with Amara still weak but alert, she began to talk in halting sentences, as though each word carried its own weight. They have rules, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the paper cup of cocoa the nurse had left on the tray. Rules I have to follow if I don't want to make things worse. I asked her gently, what kind of rules, baby? She didn't look at me when she answered. Don't call you, ever. They said you'd try to poison me against them, that you were jealous and unstable. Don't cry in public. If I get upset, I have to excuse myself quietly. Don't embarrass Nathan. That's the worst one. If I do, Her voice trailed off, her throat tightening until the rest dissolved into silence. I pressed her hand. If you do what? Her lips trembled and tears welled up. He sends me outside to cool off. The words made my stomach twist. I pressed her for details, and little by little, she unraveled the truth. The first time it happened, it was autumn, a year into their marriage. They had hosted a small dinner, and Amara had laughed too loud at one of her own stories. Later, Nathan told her she was making a fool of herself. When she defended herself, he opened the front door and told her to take a walk until she learned how to behave. She stood outside in the chill for half an hour before he let her back in. The second time it was worse. Early winter, guests over again. She asked Nathan why he misrepresented one of his work projects. He cut her off at the table, his voice sharp. Later, he shoved her out into the snow with no coat. Think about your place, he told her through the glass before closing the door. She lasted only a few minutes before he allowed her back inside. He called it discipline. She called it her fault. And then came New Year's Eve. They were all drinking and laughing, she said, her voice barely audible. I asked if I could call you to wish you Happy New Year. Nathan's mother said, why drag her into our celebration? She doesn't belong here. Nathan told me to drop it. I didn't. I told him you were my mother, that you deserved to hear from me. He smiled in front of everyone, then grabbed my wrist under the table. He whispered that if I said another word, I'd regret it. Her tears fell fast, soaking into the blanket. And then he sent me outside. This time nobody argued. Nobody looked away. They just kept laughing, Mama. Like it was normal. Like I didn't matter. Hearing it, I felt something inside me harden beyond repair. My daughter, my child I raised on my back, working double shifts, patching together a life from scraps, had been turned into a puppet, punished for the crime of having a voice. And the people who should have protected her sat by the fire, sipping champagne, while she froze in the dark. I wanted to storm that estate again, tear it apart brick by brick, and drag every one of them into the snow. But rage burns too fast. I've lived long enough to know fire dies quickly if it isn't fed with purpose. So instead I held Amara close, stroked her hair and whispered, they think silence is strength. But silence is glass, baby. And I know how to shatter glass. From that moment forward, I stopped seeing the Whitmores as untouchable giants. They were fragile, brittle, hiding behind chandeliers and polished smiles. I knew if I waited long enough, if I looked closely enough, I'd find the weak stone in their fortress. And when I did, I would bring the whole thing crashing down. That night, as Amara finally drifted into sleep, I sat in the hospital chair and made myself a vow. They would regret every rule, every smirk, every locked door. They thought they had written me out of her life, but they had only written themselves into their own downfall. Back in Denver, my apartment near Sloan's Lake had never felt so small yet so safe. The heat clanged through the vents, my old couch sagged under the weight of years, and the paint on the walls had dulled, but it was mine. It was real. And now, for the first time in years, Amara was inside it, curled under blankets, sleeping for nearly 20 hours straight. I sat in the recliner by the window, watching her chest rise and fall, memorizing the simple fact that she was breathing under my roof again. While she slept, I moved quietly. I'd spent years mourning in silence, but now my mourning turned into movement. Their fortress was tall, but I knew every fortress has a weak stone, and I intended to find it. I pulled out an old folder where I had tucked away every scrap of paper I'd ever had with Nathan's name on it. The prenuptial agreement copy Amara once showed me, tax records from the Whitmore Family Foundation I'd downloaded from public filings, even invitations from their charity galas that listed donors and partners. To most, it was meaningless clutter. To me, it was a map. I spread it across the kitchen table, the same table where Amara once did her homework. Line by line, I began circling things. Dates that didn't match, vendors listed without state registrations, donations that disappeared between filings. It wasn't enough to accuse them yet, but it was enough to smell blood. I knew I couldn't do this alone. So I picked up the phone and called an old friend, someone who had sat with me through night shifts at Denver Health years ago. She'd left nursing for paralegal work, but she still answered when I called. I told her what I suspected. She didn't dismiss me. She just said, "Bring what you have. We'll look." A few days later, we sat in her small office downtown, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She spread my papers across her desk, scanned through the prenuptial, and then leaned back in her chair with a frown. "You see this? she asked, tapping the document. He signed this claiming full disclosure of his finances. That means every debt, every liability, every outstanding loan had to be on the table. And it wasn't. Yes. She shook her head. Not even close. If what I'm hearing about his gambling is true, and we can trace it to undisclosed debts, this prenup is voidable. That means Amara isn't trapped in whatever deal they cornered her into. It also means discovery, subpoenas, depositions. The Whitmores won't want that smoke. Her words settled over me like the first sunlight after a storm. 4 years I had been shut out, made to feel powerless, as though their silence had stripped me of agency. But now, for the first time, I had a weapon. Not gossip, not hearsay, paper. The kind of evidence courts listened to, the kind of trail that cracked legacies. When I came home that night, Amara was awake, sipping soup from the kitchen counter. She looked fragile still, but there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I kissed her forehead and told her simply, "Baby, their fortress isn't as strong as it looks." She didn't ask for details yet, and I didn't burden her with them. She needed to heal. But I could feel it. We were both beginning to stand again, piece by piece. Laying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the years they had stolen from us. 3 birthdays, 3 Christmases, 3 years of mother and daughter severed by lies. They had built their empire on polished glass, confident no one would ever challenge them. But I had something they didn't: time, patience, and truth. And truth, once it finds a crack, spreads like fire. Nathan Whitmore built his entire life on polish. Pressed suits, rehearsed smiles, the illusion of control. But mirrors don't lie forever. Look at them long enough, and you see the cracks. I spent weeks after Amara came home tracing those cracks, and once I found them, I knew exactly how fragile he really was. It started with Black Hawk. If you're from Colorado, you know the place. Casinos tucked into the mountains, neon lights glowing against the dark sky, busloads of people chasing luck. My paralegal friend pulled his credit card statements, and there it was in black and white. Repeated charges from hotels and restaurants in Black Hawk, dates that lined up with days Nathan had told Amara he was in important business meetings. He wasn't negotiating contracts. He was rolling dice and feeding slot machines. Next came the therapy bills. Buried under a shell LLC, hidden as consulting services, were payments to a private clinic in Denver that specialized in gambling addiction. They weren't listed in the prenup, and they certainly weren't disclosed to Amara. My friend highlighted the line item with a red pen and said, "This alone could unravel him." But there was more. Much more. I traced money through accounts that looked legitimate until I tugged at the seams. A consulting vendor, supposedly working with the Whitmore Family Foundation, didn't exist on the Colorado Business Registry. No address, no phone number. Just an account number receiving thousands of dollars every quarter. I followed the trail, and it looped right back to Nathan. Money funneled through shadows to cover his losses. I sat at my kitchen table night after night, the same table where Amara once colored picture books as a child, now covered in stacks of paper, receipts, and notes. I drew lines with a pen, connecting dates, places, and names. Casino charges, shell accounts, fake vendors, therapy bills. It all formed a web, and at the center was Nathan. The man who told my daughter she couldn't laugh too loud. The man who left her barefoot in the snow. The man who thought his reflection in the mirror was untouchable. I wasn't alone in this work. A former houseman from the Whitmore estate called me quietly one evening. He had seen too much and had no loyalty left. He described nights Nathan disappeared, arguments about missing money, Elaine whispering, "Keep it quiet. We can't afford scandal." His affidavit joined my growing pile. Then a caterer came forward, recalling how Nathan once barked at Amara in the kitchen, shoving her out onto the patio while guests drank champagne inside. Piece by piece the cracks widened. I knew better than to move recklessly. Rage wants you to storm the gates, but I had learned long ago that patience wins wars. So I began to build not just evidence but a plan. The Whitmores wielded silence like a weapon, but I had learned that silence can be broken with one thing stronger than all their wealth: truth. Real, documented, notarized, undeniable truth. My strategy wasn't to scream, wasn't to beg anyone to believe me. My strategy was to put their secrets under such a bright light that even they couldn't deny them. I would make Nathan's debts, his addictions, his fraud the very stones that cracked their fortress. And when the cracks spread through their glass walls, everyone in Aspen, in Denver, in every circle they cherished, would see the Whitmores for what they were. That night, as I looked over the web I'd drawn across my kitchen table, I whispered to myself, they thought they could erase me, but they forgot I'm a nurse. I know how to read charts. I know how to follow symptoms back to the disease. And Nathan, you are the disease in this family. I will expose you. The cracks were already there. All I had to do was press until the mirror shattered. I knew the Whitmores wouldn't stay quiet forever. People like them never take a hit without trying to hit back. And sure enough, as soon as the first cracks in Nathan's mirror began to show, their machine roared to life. They didn't come at me with fists or open threats. No, their weapons were the same ones they'd always used. Whispers, influence, and paperwork sharpened into knives. The first blow was a smear campaign. Suddenly I was unstable. I was jealous. I was vindictive. At least, that's what began circulating in Aspen dinner parties and Cherry Creek luncheons. Friends I'd known for years started to look at me differently. A woman at the grocery store leaned in and said, I heard you've been causing trouble for poor Nathan. Such a shame you can't just let your daughter live her life. She said it with pity, but her eyes gleamed with gossip. The Whitmores had spun their story well. I wasn't a mother fighting for her child. I was a bitter woman stirring drama. Then came the second blow. A manila envelope arrived at my apartment, slid under the door like poison. Inside was a custody petition. Nathan was claiming I was unfit, that I posed a dangerous influence on Amara. He listed fabricated incidents, anger outbursts, financial recklessness, even suggestions that I'd tried to alienate Amara from her marriage. Reading those words made my hands shake, not from fear but from fury. They had left my daughter to freeze in the snow, and I was the one being painted as a danger. The third blow was quieter, but it cut deep. I started to feel the town gossip. Neighbors who once waved across Sloan's Lake now turned their faces. Former colleagues muttered about me, chasing attention. Even in the church pews I heard whispers. Celeste can't let go, Celeste is just angry. The Whitmores knew how to use their reputation like a hammer, and they were pounding at me from every direction. But I didn't break. I didn't even bend. Because unlike them, I wasn't operating from fear. I had the truth. And the truth doesn't flinch when someone calls it a lie. I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of evidence. Casino charges, therapy bills, shell accounts, affidavits, and reminded myself, paper doesn't gossip. Paper doesn't smear. Paper stands. I hired a lawyer in Denver who wasn't dazzled by Aspen money. She looked at the petition, then looked at me with steady eyes. They're trying to rattle you, she said. This is about intimidation, not justice. But if you've got what you say you've got, they've got more to lose than you do. And she was right. I could already feel the Whitmores' panic in how sloppily they moved. Smearing me meant drawing attention to a fight they wanted hidden. Filing for custody meant putting Nathan under a spotlight he couldn't afford. Every blow they threw at me was a crack in their own armor. So I stayed calm. I went about my days, caring for Amara, making soup, sitting with her as she slowly unlearned the rules they drilled into her. I listened to her voice grow steadier each day, and I let that be my anchor. Because while the Whitmores spent their nights whispering lies into the world, I was planting seeds of truth that would grow too tall for them to ever cut down. Let them call me unstable. Let them call me jealous. Let them call me vindictive. Words don't scare me. I've lived 63 years, raised a daughter on my own, and survived more storms than they could ever imagine. I knew what I was, and I knew what they were. And I also knew that the day would come when the lies they spread about me would be drowned out by the truth about them. The Whitmores thought they were retaliating, but what they were really doing was showing me how desperate they had become. And desperation, I've learned, is the beginning of downfall. 4 years, Nathan Whitmore moved through the world like a man coated in glass. Smooth, flawless, reflecting whatever image he wanted others to see. But I knew better. I had been tracing the fractures in that glass for months, waiting for the moment when one tiny break would spiderweb across his entire reflection. That moment finally came, and when it did, it wasn't by my hand. It came from someone else who had seen enough. The photos showed up quietly at first. Grainy snapshots passed around on cell phones in Denver and Aspen. Nathan outside a gambling club in Black Hawk. His tie undone. His suit wrinkled, eyes glassy with desperation. In one shot, he clutched a wad of cash like it was a lifeline. In another, he stumbled toward a car long after midnight, looking nothing like the polished businessman he pretended to be. I didn't leak them. I didn't need to. Men like Nathan always leave enemies behind. Dealers unpaid, partners betrayed, staff mistreated. Someone else had decided it was time the world saw what I had already uncovered. And once those photos began circulating, there was no taking them back. I knew the Whitmores had seen them when Amara's phone rang at 2:14 a.m. Elaine's name flashed across the screen. Amara hesitated, then put it on speaker. Her mother-in-law's voice was sharp with panic, stripped of its usual refinement. "Delete whatever you have," she hissed. "Do you hear me? Delete it now. Don't you dare let this get out any further." Amara glanced at me, her eyes wide. "We didn't post anything," she whispered back. But Elaine wasn't listening. Her voice cracked as she said, "This family cannot afford scandal. You'll destroy us if you don't comply." Then the line went dead. For the first time in years, I heard real fear in Elaine's voice. Not fear of me. Not fear of Amara. Fear of exposure. Fear of the truth creeping into the perfect glass house she had spent decades curating. The fallout began almost immediately. The Whitmore Family Foundation, their prized jewel, started fielding calls from board members. One of them, an accountant with a conscience, began asking why so many consulting fees were being funneled to a vendor no one had ever met. Those questions spread to the Charity Oversight Office at the state level. The same office my paralegal friend had quietly flagged weeks earlier with documents I'd collected. By the end of that week, whispers were circling in every corner of their world. "Did you see those photos of Nathan? Why was Elaine so evasive at the luncheon? Have you noticed Richard hasn't spoken at the last 2 meetings?" Their carefully polished image was no longer intact. It was cloudy, smudged with doubt. And me. I stayed silent. I didn't boast. I didn't gloat. I simply kept moving, gathering, stacking more truth onto the pile I was building. Because I understood what the Whitmores didn't. Once the first crack appears, mirrors don't repair themselves. They shatter. I watched Amara that week, too. For the first time, I saw her doubt the image she had been forced to accept. She replayed that voicemail from Elaine over and over, her face pale as she listened to the panic in her mother-in-law's voice. "She's scared," Amara whispered one night. "Mama, I've never heard her sound scared before." I placed my hand over hers and said softly, "That's what happens when people who live on lies are forced to face the truth. Fear is their first language when control slips away." Nathan had been the Whitmores' golden son-in-law, the mirror they used to reflect their perfection back into the world. But now, in the eyes of the people who mattered most to them, that mirror was cracked. And the cracks weren't just visible, they were spreading. The Whitmores had tried to smear me as unstable, bitter, jealous. But the world was beginning to see who really fit those words. And I knew this was only the beginning. By the time the photos of Nathan outside the gambling club had finished circling, I knew the Whitmores were scrambling. But scandal in whispers wasn't enough for me. Whispers fade. I wanted paper. Paper stands. Paper speaks in courtrooms and boardrooms where lies crumble under oath. So I built my counterstrike not with rage, but with records. The first weapon I placed on the table was Amara's hospital file. Aspen Valley Hospital had documented everything the night I carried her in half-frozen. Her body temperature, the early frost nip, the dehydration. They noted her statement, too, that she had been locked outside. No matter what story Nathan or his parents spun, the medical records told the truth. I requested certified copies and tucked them into my growing folder, each stamped with a hospital seal like a bullet casing ready for use. Next, I gathered affidavits. The former houseman, tired of silence, signed a sworn statement describing how he had been ordered to ignore Amara when she was sent outside to cool off. A caterer added her account of watching Nathan shove Amara out the door during a dinner party while Elaine smoothed it over with a laugh. One by one, small voices became documents with weight. I knew enough about the law to understand what those meant. Testimony. Testimony couldn't be erased with donations or pearls. And then I took the fight to their foundation, the crown jewel of the Whitmore name. Through my paralegal friend, I handed over copies of vendor payments that led nowhere, payments hidden under the phrase consulting services that just happened to align with Nathan's gambling binges. I didn't march into their offices waving accusations. I slipped it quietly into the hands of the right people. Regulators who had the authority to dig without emotion, auditors who only cared about math. Within weeks, questions began to circulate where the Whitmores least wanted them. State officials in Denver asked why a six-figure vendor didn't appear on any registry. Charity board members requested receipts that didn't exist. Words like irregularities and potential subpoenas started to surface in hushed calls and meeting minutes. The fortress that had once seemed airtight was suddenly riddled with holes. I could feel the Whitmores' unease in the way Elaine carried herself. At a fundraiser I slipped into, she spotted me across the room and her smile faltered. She leaned in close to another board member, whispering with urgency, her pearls trembling against her collarbone. Richard avoided eye contact altogether, his jaw tight, his drink clutched like a lifeline. Nathan tried to bluff, laughing too loud, shaking hands too firmly, but the sweat beading at his temples betrayed him. For the first time, they weren't in control of the narrative. They couldn't smear me out of existence. They couldn't lock me outside their glass walls. Because this time I wasn't banging on their doors. I was pressing on the weak stones of their foundation, and the cracks were spreading where they least expected them. My lawyer told me, they'll try to settle before it gets public. They won't risk subpoenas. Discovery would drag every skeleton into the open. I smiled when she said that because I knew she was right. The Whitmores didn't fear me. They feared exposure. They feared their name in headlines next to words like fraud, gambling, misconduct. They feared truth. That night, sitting in my Sloan's Lake apartment with Amara beside me, I looked at the growing pile of documents and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Steady. Not desperate, not silenced, but steady. I leaned toward her and whispered, "They think they can trap us, baby. But they're the ones cornered now. They just don't know it yet." The Whitmores had built their fortress on mirrors and glass. And with every affidavit, every hospital record, every questionable payment, I was pulling the curtains back. The light was pouring in. And once light enters a place built on lies, shadows have nowhere left to hide. The courtroom in Denver smelled of polish and old paper, a place where legacies are tested and reputations either hold or collapse. The Whitmores came dressed for war. Elaine in her pearls, Richard in his pressed navy suit, Nathan sitting tall in a tailored jacket that looked borrowed from his father's closet of illusions. Their supporters filled the benches, a line of polished friends and business partners ready to nod at every word their lawyer spoke. I sat on the opposite side, dressed in black, not pearls but strength, not diamonds but truth. My lawyer leaned close before the hearing began and whispered, "Stay calm. Let the paper talk." And I did, because I knew their fortress wasn't as solid as it looked from the outside. The Whitmore's attorney went first. He painted me as reckless, unstable, a bitter woman who couldn't accept her daughter's marriage into a higher world. He used words like erratic and vindictive. He pointed to the fact that I had stormed into their home on New Year's Eve, holding my daughter in my arms, as proof that I was volatile. Every word dripped with arrogance, every phrase polished to tarnish me. I watched as heads in their crowd nodded along, and I felt their eyes burning into my back, waiting for me to flinch. But I didn't flinch. When my lawyer rose, the tone shifted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She began placing evidence on the table, one piece at a time, each more damning than the last. First, the photos. Grainy images of Nathan outside the Black Hawk Club, tie loose, eyes glassy, clutching a wad of cash. A murmur rippled through the room. Then came the gambling therapy bills, disguised as consulting services. Next, the hospital records from Aspen Valley, documenting Amara's low core temperature, frostnip, and the statement that she had been locked outside. The judge leaned forward at that. Then she introduced affidavits. The houseman who had seen Amara punished with cold, the caterer who described Nathan shoving her outside during a dinner party, the whispers Elaine had tried to smooth over with false laughter. One by one, they stacked up, undeniable, heavy as bricks. Finally, she spread the financial irregularities, vendor payments that led nowhere, shell accounts tied directly back to Nathan. "Your Honor," my lawyer said, her voice steady, "this is not the picture of a stable, responsible husband. This is a man drowning in debts and deception, who has no hesitation punishing his wife in ways that put her health at risk. The Whitmores may be wealthy, but wealth does not erase cruelty." The judge's expression shifted, patience thinning with each document. He turned to Nathan's attorney. "Do you have any explanation for these records?" The man stammered, flipping pages, muttering about misunderstandings. But excuses don't erase evidence. And then came the moment I will never forget. Amara rose to testify. She was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the stand, but her voice carried. She looked at the judge, not at Nathan, not at his parents, and said, "Being put outside was not a boundary. It was cruelty. It was punishment for speaking. And it happened more than once." The room went silent. Elaine stiffened, her pearls frozen against her neck. Richard clenched his jaw. Nathan shifted in his chair, eyes darting. But Amara did not waver. She repeated her words slowly, each one a stone hurled against their glass fortress. The judge leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. For the first time I saw it, the Whitmores weren't winning. Their fortress of silence, their smear campaign, their reputation, it all meant nothing against my daughter's truth. The hearing didn't end that day, but I walked out of that courtroom lighter. Because I knew the balance had shifted. The judge had seen through their polish. And once a judge sees cracks, the law doesn't unsee them. By the time the custody hearings wrapped, the Whitmores were cornered. Discovery loomed over them like a storm cloud, and they knew it. My lawyer had already drawn up a subpoena list that would drag every skeleton into the light. Financial records, board minutes, vendor contracts, therapy notes. If those documents saw daylight, the Whitmore name would be carved into headlines not for wealth, but for scandal. And that was a risk they couldn't take. So they offered a settlement conference. It wasn't framed as surrender. It never is with people like them. They called it a chance to resolve matters quietly. But I knew what it was. Fear disguised as courtesy. We sat around a long mahogany table in a downtown Denver office tower. Elaine perched stiffly at one end. Her pearl necklace wound tight against her throat. Richard sat beside her. His jaw clenched, hands folded like a man waiting for the gallows. Nathan looked hollowed out, dark circles under his eyes, the polished mask gone. On our side sat Amara, shoulders squared, her lawyer beside her, and me just behind, steady as stone. Their attorney began with a speech about avoiding unnecessary embarrassment and reaching an amicable conclusion. My lawyer cut him off with a stack of exhibits, gambling photos, hospital records, affidavits, all neatly labeled. "If you'd prefer this to be reviewed in open court," she said calmly, "we can proceed." The silence that followed was heavy. Elaine's hand trembled against her pearls. Richard's face tightened. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. His eyes fixed on the table. The terms were laid out clearly. Amara would walk away with enough to start over. A condominium in Denver, a reliable car, health coverage while she completed her MBA at CU Denver, and a settlement fund substantial enough to keep her secure. Most importantly, the prenuptial agreement was declared void, nullified by Nathan's undisclosed debts and fraudulent concealment. There was one more condition. Nathan had to sign a stipulation acknowledging responsibility for the cruelty Amara endured, specifically the cooling-off punishments that placed her health in jeopardy. No non-disclosure agreements. No gag orders. No silencing clauses to bury the truth under money. My lawyer made it plain. If you want this over, you sign it. Otherwise, discovery begins. The Whitmores didn't argue long. Elaine tried once, her voice breaking. "We cannot allow this to tarnish the family legacy." My lawyer slid another subpoena draft across the table with the words Whitmore Foundation. Custodian of records highlighted in bold. Elaine went quiet. Richard's sigh was heavy, the sound of a man conceding to forces bigger than his pride. Nathan, for all his arrogance, was the one who looked the most broken. He held the pen in his hand for nearly a minute before finally scrawling his signature across the page that admitted what he had done. For once, his lies had no power. When it was done, Amara exhaled, as though she'd been holding her breath for 3 years. She stood, straightened her back, and walked out of that room free. No chains of silence, no threats of NDAs, no fortress walls holding her hostage. She was hers again. I followed her into the hall, and when she turned to look at me, I saw something I thought I'd lost forever. My daughter's real smile. Not the rehearsed grin she'd worn for years, but the unguarded joy of a woman reclaiming her voice. Behind us, The Whitmores sat in their silence. No laughter, no toasts, no polished small talk. Just humiliation settling into their perfect suits. They had built their legacy on control and illusions, but truth had stripped them bare. And for the first time I realized what real victory tasted like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. It was written in ink on legal paper, undeniable and permanent. The Whitmores had always believed their strength lay in their walls of glass and chandeliers, in the illusion that money and reputation could shield them from consequence. But after the settlement, their fortress didn't collapse with a crash. It unraveled the way glass does when a crack spreads quietly, slow at first, then all at once, until nothing is left but shards. The first sign was the invitations. For decades, Elaine had been at the top of every guest list. Aspen galas, Denver charity luncheons, Cherry Creek fundraisers. Her name was a guarantee of money and prestige. But within weeks the calls stopped. The glossy envelopes stopped arriving. Whispers about pending investigations and charity irregularities made her a liability, not an asset. By spring, her name had been pulled from the donor wall of a hospital foundation, marked discreetly as pending review. It was the kind of humiliation money couldn't patch over. Richard's fall came harder. He had built his identity on board seats and influence, the man people turned to for direction. But regulators had questions about the Whitmore Foundation's vendors. Questions he couldn't answer without exposing Nathan's shadow accounts. When the state hinted at subpoenas, the board demanded his resignation for the good of the organization. The announcement was dressed up in polite language, but everyone knew what it meant. He walked out of that boardroom stripped of the power he once wielded like a sword. Elaine fared no better. The same women who once clung to her side at luncheons now crossed the street to avoid her. Her pearls no longer drew admiration. They drew pity. She tried to host her own events, but empty seats and whispered refusals greeted her every attempt. The society she had ruled with manicured smiles and sharp whispers now exiled her with the same tools. And Nathan, he was hit hardest of all. He was no longer the golden son-in-law, the polished reflection of Whitmore prestige. He was the man in the gambling photos, the husband who left his wife to freeze outside, the name scribbled in hospital reports and affidavits. Aspen's social circle didn't ban him with proclamations. They simply stopped acknowledging him. He was left standing at cocktail parties where conversations shifted the moment he approached. His smile hanging in the air with nowhere to land. By summer he stopped showing up altogether. Quiet exile is louder than any scandal when your entire worth depends on being seen. I watched all of this not with gloating, but with clarity. Their fortress hadn't burned down. It had caved in under the weight of its own lies. Silence, the very weapon they had used against me, became their punishment. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. Friends vanished. Their name, once polished, now carried the dull ring of shame. Amara saw it too. She read the headlines about Richard's resignation, heard the whispers about Elaine, and saw the hollow look in Nathan's eyes when he tried to smile through the exile. One evening, sitting beside me in our small apartment, she said softly, "They made me believe silence was power. But silence is what destroyed them." I took her hand and squeezed it. That's what they never understood. Power doesn't come from silence. It comes from truth. The Whitmores had spent years trying to erase me, trying to bury my daughter under glass walls and polished lies. In the end, they buried themselves. Their fortress didn't collapse in flames or fury. It collapsed in shame, in whispers, in the quiet rejection of the very world they thought they owned. And I stood outside those ruins, not broken, not erased, but whole, with my daughter by my side. When the storm finally passed, Amara and I began to rebuild, not with marble or chandeliers, but with the simple things that had always made a home. My small apartment near Sloane's Lake became ours. The walls still bore scuff marks from years of wear, the couch sagged in the middle, and the Subaru parked out front rattled more than it should. But inside those walls, laughter returned. For the first time in years, the silence that once crushed me was replaced by music, by late-night talks, by the sound of my daughter's voice blooming again. Amara re-enrolled at CU Denver to finish the MBA she had once set aside for Nathan's approval. She walked into those classrooms not as a wife hiding behind a husband's shadow, but as herself, brilliant, determined, and free. I watched her pore over books at the kitchen table, the same table where she once colored as a child, and I knew she was reclaiming not just an education but her future. Every morning I'd make coffee and watch her head out the door with her backpack, shoulders squared. She smiled now, not the forced grin I remembered from Aspen dinners, but a real, unguarded smile that carried the weight of survival and the light of resilience. Sometimes she'd look back at me and say, "Mama, I feel like I can breathe again." And every time I whispered a thank you under my breath. We lived modestly, but it was ours. No staff to keep us at a distance, no chandeliers to drown out our voices, no glass walls to separate us. Just two women rebuilding, one step at a time, proving that dignity and joy don't come from wealth, but from truth reclaimed. Meanwhile, the Whitmores faded. They weren't destitute, not people with money like theirs, but their name no longer opened doors. Invitations dried up, their board seats stripped, their foundation tainted. At galas, their absence became louder than their presence. Elaine's pearls gathered dust in a jewelry box. Richard spent his days in quiet bitterness, stripped of the titles he once clung to. Nathan, the golden son-in-law, became a ghost in the very circles that once praised him, whispered about behind closed doors, exiled without ceremony. Their fortress remained standing on Red Mountain, but it was hollow now, a monument to what they had lost. Sometimes I'd pass by the headlines or overhear gossip in town about the Whitmore fall. I never joined in. I didn't need to. Their downfall wasn't mine to celebrate. It was theirs to live with. And that was the sharpest punishment of all. At night, when Amara and I sat on our couch with the TV flickering and the smell of popcorn in the air, I would look at her, whole and free, and feel peace for the first time in years. Not silence, the kind they tried to cage me with. Peace. Real hard-earned peace. And I would remind myself of the vow I had whispered that night in the snow, holding her frozen body against mine. They thought they could erase me, erase us with silence and lies. They thought they could take her forever. But in the end, the only thing erased was their own legacy. So I stand before you now, telling this story not as a victim, but as a mother who refused to be erased. And if you remember nothing else, remember this. They took 3 years from me. We took everything from them.